16. The father of Yuki Onna. In the days following the apartment complex being finished, Izuku hadn't had much trouble finding employees to manage the building, with his students helping to find them. Other than doing interviews with Shoji-san for other staff, Izuku chose to remain mostly hands-off with the management. He did help make ground rules for what was and wasn't allowed at the complex, but that would be about it, other than checking in once, and while that everything was running smoothly. It would only be a couple of days until people could start moving in, and Izuku had already shared the good news. The unbridled joy down at the center when he told them was the best late birthday present ever. It was about mid-August at that point, so thankfully they wouldn't have to spend another winter in the community center. Izuku and his students had done their best to winterize the building, but there was only so much they could do with the near-ruined building without it becoming a fire hazard. Because of this, there was very little that could bring him down, but with what he was about to do he found himself quite somber on the ride into the south side. In his hands, Izuku tenderly held a handmade book he had created for one of his younger students. Hori Yukiko was an incredibly sweet little 6-year-old with an ice quirk and really took after her mother Anya. Both had unfortunately been victims of the South Side fire who died early on in the incident. Their shared ice quirk made them very weak to the fire, and Izuku could only hope they had a swift end without much pain. Yukiko-chan, back in November, way before the fire, had asked him to make something very special for her. The book he just finished carefully illustrating was something she had begged him to make when she saw one of his drawings of Eraserhead. He denied her request at the time, but Yukiko-chan was stubborn and wore him down into agreeing around mid-December. Izuku found working on the project sobering but therapeutic over the 8 months since the fire. Izuku spent a painstakingly long time making sure every page was perfect, and he even went to an official Japanese-Russian translator to get the words right. Even though Izuku could no longer give the finished product to Yukiko-chan, he couldn't just stop himself from doing it. The book in a way was like Yukiko-chan's last request, and Izuku wanted to honor it. Hence why he was walking to the shrine about 2.5 hours before his classes started. The shrine had been made into something quite a bit more than the bare-bones structure he had helped throw together in a day. Handmade walls were made of the surrounding rubble to mark the boundaries of the shrine, and some structures were made to cover the rows of urns. The urns themselves were in cubbies that could be closed to protect them and whatever their loved ones left from the weather. Izuku would go to the shrine at least once a week for upkeep of it and general maintenance. Sometimes he'd leave a little thing in a cubby of one of the 37 people without anyone else at the funeral. He planned to leave the book in Yukiko-chan and Anya-san's cubby today. He put the book away in the messenger bag he had taken to carrying his things in once he entered the south side. Izuku would nod and wave whenever he passed someone he knew until he was at the shrine. He just entered the shrine and had turned to walk to the Horus cubby but paused. A tall man was standing in the shrine, and this wouldn't normally make him hesitate as he was far from the only person who went to the shrine. He's often spoken with the loved ones of the other 21 victims while there, and he's even met some he's never met before. Izuku hardly knew everyone that lived in the red light district, and meeting all the Southsiders would just be near impossible. But this man was clearly not a Southsider. After spending nearly a year with these people, he could tell with just a look. The air around the man was absolutely nothing like the one that surrounded the Southsiders. Izuku stared at him, picking apart everything he could about the man just from what he could see from 10 feet away. An expensive white hand-tailored suit and silvery silk tie, black button-up shirt and gloves, perhaps for blocking a quirk, pale skin but nearly matched his long white hair. The man had to be wealthy, and that alone raised alarm bells with him. Why would anyone with money come to the bombed-out husk of the old Musutafu? Much less the unofficial shrine he'd made with his students. Perhaps feeling Izuku's confused eyes on him, the man turned his head and his cold icy blue eyes locked back on him. Izuku tensed. He might have gotten too comfortable with his familiarity with the Southsiders, as in the face of this unknown man a great deal of his confidence left him. The man walked over swiftly, crossing the distance with only a few steps, and Izuku's stomach dropped as he timidly stared up at the man. He had at least a meter on Izuku. Izuku gulped and asked, "See, can I help why you?" Izuku sort of wanted to kick himself for stuttering like that. The man stared at him, then nodded. "You are Midoriya, yes?" he asked, voice carrying a heavy accent, probably Russian, but Izuku was more worried about why this man knew his name. "Why, yes." Izuku hesitantly responded, half considering bolting and getting someone to help him. "I apologize for showing up so suddenly. But I believe you called me about my daughter." The man told him, and Izuku blinked, staring back, sheer bafflement overpowering his weariness as he looked the man over again. Now that Izuku could see his full face, the man did look a bit familiar the longer Izuku stared. Then looking back at the man's eyes, an idea suddenly struck him, and he would have absolutely smacked himself for not realizing it earlier. Are you talking about Anya-san? Izuku questioned. Izuku had been able to scrounge up a list of emergency contacts for some of the SSI casualties and called them up. Anya-san only had one number, and Izuku did leave a voicemail with it. But he didn't know it was Anya-san's father. Anya-san hadn't spoken of her father often, so what little Izuku did know was told to him by Yukiko-chan. Which was that he had their bright white hair, pale blue eyes, lived in Russia where her mom was from, and that reason they, Anya-san and Yukiko-chan's grandfather, weren't talking was because of a big fight they had before she was born. The man nodded. I'm afraid I wasn't able to physically respond at the time of your call. I was under the effect of a quirk until about a month ago. I'm sorry I couldn't be here for the funeral you organized. He explained, apologetic tone carrying through the stiff and stoic being. Izuku's hands quickly shot up and waved frantically, and no. It's not your fault. If you were under a quirk's effect, here's nothing anyone could have done. He quickly reassured. Honestly, being under a quirk's effect was way better than the answer as for why most people hadn't come. Why, you must be looking for Anya-san and Yukiko-chan's urns, right? Follow me and I'll take you to them. Izuku offered, and he gestured to the middle row. Yes, I would greatly appreciate that, Midoriya. The man Anya-san's father replied, his voice leaning towards the monotone end of the spectrum. The shrine wasn't that big, so it hadn't been much of a walk to where the Horus cubby was. Izuku was able to remove the covering with ease after the countless times he's done so before, and inside the cubby lay a sight that was heart-achingly familiar to Izuku. Two dark blue urns with white specks sat together on a little shelf inside the cubby. Izuku hadn't been able to find any pictures of the two, and so a drawing he made of the two was in between the urns alongside the name tags. At the bottom of the cubby, a place to burn incense or put a candle, and a couple of tiny figurines Izuku had placed there for them. Izuku's gaze fell to his feet, and he began to lightly pick at his nails. I'm sorry, the drawing isn't very good, but I couldn't find any pictures of them, and not having a photo just felt wrong. Izuku nervously explained. He had made quite a few drawings in place of pictures for the victims of the SSI, since most of the pictures they did have burned in the fire, or because their loved ones didn't have any either. It's wonderful, you've captured them perfectly, he told Izuku, reaching a hand out to trace one of their faces, only to stop before he touched the glass. Izuku averted his gaze again, this time a bit flattered, but also because he felt like he was intruding on what should be a private moment. Izuku was about to quietly slip away with plans of putting Yukiko-chan's book in the cubby later when the man spoke up. For a long time I thought Anya never spoke a word of me after our fight. Izuku paused, risking a glance at the man. Then a few weeks before November I got a call from her for the first time in nearly 8 years, and we talked about things. He explained. I had a Vienuka. He muttered, getting slightly choked up, and Izuku couldn't help biting his lip as he felt sympathy for him. He felt horrid over the loss of the two, and he couldn't imagine how much worse he'd feel if he learned of a grandchild only for them to die before he could ever meet them. A week later I got my first letter from her, he said, pulling a folded up paper, and upon him unfolding it Izuku nearly gasped. In addition to what he recognized as Yukiko-chan's messy handwriting was a drawing of what was supposed to be 4 people, 3 with white hair and 1 with green hair. Izuku no doubt had a similar drawing on his desk from when the kids all got together to give him one. He almost wanted to ask the man to let him look at it, but bit his tongue. Izuku had no right to ask anything like that of the man. It was the first of many. She often spoke of this young man who taught her just about anything she wanted to know about. Anya even sent me a picture of you, he went on to explain, putting the letter back and taking out a small picture frame. He set it by Izuku's drawing of the Horus, and Izuku was almost crying when he saw it. It was a small photo of Izuku and Yukiko-chan from mid-December. She was sitting on his lap excitedly pointing to something in a book. Izuku hadn't seen her in months, and seeing the photo of her looking so happy just tugged on his heartstrings. Izuku turned to thank the man for sharing the picture, even if it was only for however long he was going to visit, when he saw the man had knelt on one knee to be closer to his height. Anya, for all her faults, was a woman of pride just like her mother, and unfortunately, as stubborn as her father. I have no doubts after our fight she truly meant it when she cut all ties with me, he said. Anya-san, not to speak ill of the dead, could be proud, and Izuku remembered a few times where he'd have to convince her to do something simple like go to a free clinic. Anya said you were the reason she chose to reach out to me. There are no words that cannot explain how thankful I am for you helping me reconnect with my daughter and giving me the chance to speak with my granddaughter before I lost them both forever. The man told him, his eyes not nearly as cold as he stared at him now. Oh God. Izuku wasn't built to handle this, and tears began rolled down his cheeks. His hands clenched his messenger bag to keep himself from flinging himself at the man to crush him in a hug. "I didn't do tea that much, sir," he muttered, locking his eyes on his feet. Yuri. The man interrupted him. Izuku gulped. Why Yuri-san? He corrected. Perhaps not, but I would have severely regretted leaving things with my daughter the way we did. Because of you, I don't have to live with the guilt of our last words being those of indifference, so thank you, Midoriya. Yuri responded, bowing his head to Izuku. Then Yuri stood up, brushing off his clothes, and he glanced at the drawing before he began to leave. Izuku, while wrapped up in a swarm of emotions, almost couldn't find his voice. Wait. He exclaimed, running after Yuri. The man did and turned to Izuku, staring at him. Izuku quickly fumbled with his bag and carefully took out the book and offered it to Yuri. Why Yukiko-chan? She asked me to make this. She said that she wanted to share her favorite fairy tale with someone special. I'm pretty sure she meant you, Yuri-san. Izuku rumbled off. Yuri's eyes widened just a bit and he sharply inhaled upon seeing the book. I don't think I should, he started to softly protest, but Izuku cut him off. It's what Yukiko-chan would have wanted. He told him. Yuri glanced at Izuku's eyes before he hesitantly moved to take the book from him. Their hands briefly touched as Yuri took the book, and the frigid chill that immediately filled Izuku was so harsh it made him feel like his bones were rattled. Izuku did his best not to physically shake, but he couldn't stop from trembling afterward. Yuri carefully held the book and tenderly ran his fingers over the cover he drew. His eyes melted with morose emotions and Yuri swallowed audibly. Izuku's chest felt tighter at the sound, but he forced a wobbly smile for him. I'm sure Yukiko-chan would have adored you, Yuri-san. He said, trying to ignore his own emotional turmoil in the statement. Thank you, Midoriya. Yuri muttered, his voice much quieter as he held the book close to his chest. Anya-san was teaching me some Russian. A rad poznakomitsa s vami, Yuri-san. Izuku told him, sure he had fumbled something when he said it. Prosage, Midoriya. He responded. Yuri gave him a nod and Izuku thought he could see him tearing up before he left Izuku alone in the shrine. Izuku felt like he was justified in giving himself an hour to cry. Thankfully no one would think that would be weird. Chapter 17. Drawing a line. An hour later Izuku managed to get himself together, but his eyes were a bit puffy from crying so long, though that was rarely something odd after leaving the shrine. Izuku slapped his cheeks to help him ignore the still present chill of Yuri-san and get back into a proper mindset to get on with his day. Izuku also had plans to visit the complex, so he hurried over there. He greeted Shoji-san before taking a clipboard to help her do a final walkthrough to see if there was anything that needed a last-minute fix. Izuku wouldn't doubt his luck that something would happen in the last 48-hour period. And yeah, Izuku was right, something did happen. As he had finished checking the sink on a ground floor unit, he heard a sickening sound he had grown uncomfortably familiar with. A firefight, that, judging from how loud it was, had to be on the street in front of the complex. Normally Izuku would just ignore it or go around it if he was on the way to where he taught. Since the fire, however, Izuku always felt this sickening twist in his gut as he shamefully avoided them. But right now, as he stood in the building he paid for, and after that heart-wrenching conversation with Yuri-san, he felt paralyzed once the first gunshot echoed out. Izuku's stomach flipped, and he nearly threw up for a minute, tears falling as he dry-heaved over spiraling thoughts of what would no doubt be out there, of the street being coated in his students' blood and bodies splayed everywhere. He was even able to vividly imagine it all as flashbacks from the South Side Inferno inserted themselves to his horrid thoughts. Izuku was moments away from praying for it to just stop when the door to the unit suddenly opened. Turning, he saw little Kaori-chan run inside and cling to his leg, crying. Distantly, Izuku remembered Masao-san had volunteered to help do final checks on the complex. He must have brought Kaori-chan with him. Upon seeing how scared Kaori-chan was, he felt something he couldn't begin to describe, and then a startling connection was made in Izuku's mind. Had this been what Yukiko-chan's last moments were like? Clinging to Anya-san as their once relatively safe home burned around them? Just as suddenly, a switch inside of him was flipped, and all of his despair, fear, and guilt, along with many other similar emotions that had been suffocating him, was swiftly and firmly pushed to the far recesses of Izuku's mind. Outrage had all but possessed the greenette as he carefully guided Kaori-chan to the unit's bathroom. Honeyed words of comfort fell from his lips as he assured her everything would soon be all right. He felt a twinge of regret as he left Kaori-chan alone in the unit, but it was quickly drowned out by the sound of the firefight not 10 meters away from him. Izuku spared some mental energy to thank Yuri-san for his icy touch, as even though it wasn't intended, his chill running through Izuku's veins helped to numb his panicked thoughts so he could calmly walk over to the carnage. Izuku briefly stared at the two fighting sides, practically deaf to everything but his own heartbeat. Spotting what he needed, he calmly walked over to a puddle and picked up a gun from it, then turned back to his apartment complex. He slowly ascended the outdoor stairs to the 3rd level and went to the part that overlooked the fight. He waited patiently for a moment for everything to die down. When both sides stopped to resupply, Izuku raised the gun, fired off 3 shots in rapid succession. Due to the lack of noise, many jumped from the sound, and Izuku, channeling his inner Kachan, yelled, "Oi!" getting everyone's attention. He glared down at them all, and judging by their reactions, he might as well be the devil himself. Good. Izuku grimly mused in his mind. Both of the gangs that were fighting had members in his lessons, and he couldn't stop his face from twisting in disgust when he recognized someone down there that he knew. "You all have till the count of 5, Izuku snarled. His hand not holding the gun had the guard rail in a white-knuckled death grip. "To drop your weapons and stop whatever you're doing, or you will permanently ban yourselves and every member of your group from my lessons," he sternly warned them, watching them stare back at him dumbly. When they didn't move fast enough for him, Izuku didn't hesitate to fire the gun again. "1," he announced, waited a second, then let off another shot. 2. Izuku growled, and thankfully for his quickly dwindling patience, he didn't have to fire a 3rd round for him to get his point across. A series of clangs and thuds echoed as they raised their hands in surrender. "Good. Now, unless you want me to cut all ties to you and your groups, we're going to take care of the injured, regardless of faction," he snapped, his fury burning in his eyes. Izuku had decided in this moment that he was done watching his students tearing themselves apart, not on the grounds of the Southside Inferno, especially not 2 blocks from the shrine he had made. This is neutral territory, and anyone else caught starting shit can consider themselves permanently banned from lessons, my aid and my property, he ruthlessly proclaimed. "When lessons begin an hour late, you can all tell everyone exactly why," he snapped, not caring about the venom lacing his words. There was no argument from any of them, and they skittishly got to work taking care of the injured. Izuku was still furious, and it was crawling under his skin, leaving his blood boiling. The result had left him seething in contempt, which was only soothed by Yuri-san's lingering chill. "Midoriya-san?" someone hesitantly called. Izuku turned and saw a very concerned Masao-san standing behind him, holding a passed-out Kaori-chan. Izuku took a deep breath, trying to calm down. "Don't worry, Miyaki-san, everything's fine," he assured, pinching the bridge of his nose. Masao-san's eyes flickered down to his other hand and pointed to it. "Where'd you get that?" he asked. Izuku looked down at the gun he'd carelessly nabbed before and only now realized it, and the hand he held it in was bloody. Izuku stared at the weapon, briefly disconnected from reality until his actions sunk in, and he mentally freaked out. What did I just do? Did I really just yell at 2 gangs? I just threatened gang members who could kill me just like that. What about that symbiotic relationship Zachary talked about? What if I just broke that fragile trust we've built? Why did I have to poke the bear? Wait. What about the gun? Oh God, I've shot a gun. Wait, it's covered in blood. That puddle was a puddle of blood. I have someone's blood on my hands." Izuku cut those thoughts off because he would have vomited if he continued his mental tangent. He swallowed the massive lump that formed in his throat. "Someone down there, I'm going to return it." he meekly said and shakily walked back down to the ground floor to help with the injured. Chapter 18. Karma. When all the emotional turmoil from the firefight yesterday melted away, Izuku's mind had been locked into a cycle, repeating a mental chant of, "I'm fucked. I'm fucked. I'm fucked." While no one had retaliated against him after his lessons or when he scurried home, Izuku knew you don't mess with two gangs without some kind of backlash, so as he made his way to the south side, he felt anxious for the first time in a while. No one jumped him when he entered the district, and quite a few people were concerned when they saw how worried Izuku was. Upon getting to the complex, he'd hoped to just check what the damage to the building was, but froze when he entered the office. Standing in front of Shoji-san were two men that he recognized as the respective leaders of the gangs that fought yesterday. He stood frozen like a deer in headlights, staring at the two. Midoriya-san? Shoji-san meekly called, clearly just as nervous about the men. Izuku cleared his throat. Everything is fine, Shoji-san. Why don't you get started on the sea cleanup? He suggested, trembling as he gave them a smile he hadn't used since Aldera. Shoji-san hesitated but ultimately left Izuku alone with them. He timidly met their eyes, and he tightly closed his eyes once he saw a hint of movement. He braced himself for the inevitable. "We are terribly sorry for the trouble we have caused, Deku-sensei. Please forgive us." Izuku jolted from the simultaneous exclamations, and when he opened his eyes, he saw both of them had moved to bow to the floor. Izuku's fury must have put the fear of God into them, because that is the only explanation for what happened next. Because both gang leaders, having come here solely to apologize for the firefight between their members, in person to him, they went on to apologize for the next 5 minutes while Izuku stood there dumbstruck. Coming back to himself, Izuku picked his jaw up off the floor and was quick to reassure them he wasn't going to hold a grudge about this. "Gee guys, really, it's not that bad. Honestly, I forgive you both, just don't let it happen again." Izuku tried to tell them, but neither would hear a word of it. They were insistent on doing something to make up for it. Izuku eventually had to relent as they weren't taking no for an answer. He was expecting something simple like free labor from their members or staying clear of his areas for a period. So one could imagine his surprise when they both dropped a duffel bag full of money on the front desk. He blue-screened as he stared at the money in complete disbelief. I can't accept this. Where did all this even come from?" Izuku exclaimed once he mentally rebooted. "Don't worry, Deku-sensei, it's all clean money." One of the men assured and the other nodded, "Nothing counterfeit." And Izuku balked. That's not what I was worried about," he protested, the teen's voice cracking. Of course, Izuku tried to refuse the money at first on principle alone that he couldn't take so much from them, but backed down when that only got him threats of them doing more to repay him. So when both men left, they left both bags of money, and a stupefied Izuku was trying to comprehend how yelling at a gang got him rich. The Greenette ended up choosing to deal with this situation in the tried and true method of pushing it to the back of his mind and freaking out about what his life had become in the safety of his bedroom. Existential crises, of course, are exactly what beds were made for. So, he left both bags in the office and informed Shoji-san not to let anyone mess with them before helping to patch up bullet holes with her. He went to the shrine to check that it was also alright and hadn't any damage from the fight. He also prayed for some guidance before he moved on to the community center. During his lessons, Izuku learned that they had indeed told everyone of what happened and had taken his new rule of neutral territory very seriously. One of the night crawlers had nervously asked him if the neutrality extended to the community center. Izuku fumbled for a moment before saying that any property of his was to be considered a neutral zone. Once he was done with his work, he picked the duffel bags up from Shoji-san and took them home to go through them. Izuku sat at his desk in his room to count out the money to see just how much they gave him. While counting, he noticed that there were no sequential bills, and with the stains, Izuku began to believe that they got some of the money from collecting it off the streets. When he was done, Izuku nearly lost it as he sat staring at the stack of 924,396,300 yen with a loss for words. Neither of the gangs were small time, but to think they could get this much in less than 48 hours because they thought they had to make up for making him mad. Izuku had no idea what to do with all this money. He was going to use it to help the Southsiders, obviously, but other than that he had no idea what to do. He considered building another apartment complex, but he wasn't confident about it. After a few moments of thought, he chose to do some research on economics before he firmly decided to have multiple little storefronts built. Izuku would have an assortment of different shops, a bakery, little corner stores, etc. The stores would bring in income for him, but he'll also make jobs for Southsiders, well, legal ones, and he could spread his care packages and supplies more freely to the Southsiders. With this thought in mind, he looked through his notes for the Uraraka-san's number. She had been a great person to work with and she was familiar with the area. Chapter 19. Dinner Conversation. Izuku took some time out of his schedule yesterday to visit the Urarakas in person about his plans and asked Uraraka-san to help him draw up the blueprints. They discussed the pros and cons of the placement of each store, and Izuku decided to limit the number of buildings to 5. He was still running the numbers in his head when he was packing up his things after his lessons and was getting ready to go home. There was a knock by the entrance and Izuku turned to see who it was. His students sometimes asked for one-on-one sessions after his lessons, so he wasn't surprised by this anymore. But at the door wasn't a Southsider, but he did look somewhat familiar. A relative of Zachary, maybe judging by the similar hair and quirk mutations. You Deku sensei? The man asked. Izuku was a bit more prepared for the cloud of anxiety after meeting Yuri-san, but this man was dressed closer to the way Southsiders were. Yes, can I help you? He asked. The man rubbed his neck and averted his eyes. Z said you could help me with figuring out how to read kanji. He bashfully answered the way most adults did when they asked him for help. I know you haven't taught anyone outside of the Siders, but since Z is my punk of brother, thought you might make an exception. He said, a bit hesitant. Izuku perked up. Oh, of course. I mean I don't care, you're not a Southsider and I would be happy to help you with kanji. He excitedly gestured him to come into the center. Izuku would always be happy to help anyone who simply asked. Izuku didn't have to teach him the basics, so he spent a half hour with him working on his spelling. They parted ways when Izuku left the community center and he was merrily on his way to head home. He was about to get to Sakiya Station but paused when he got a call. He didn't recognize the number, but he didn't know every one of his students' numbers by heart, so he answered it. Hello? He said and got a response from a familiar voice, Zdravstvuyuj, Midoriya. Izuku blinked a bit mystified. Oh. Yuri-san, I didn't know you still had my number. He replied genuinely surprised. He had called Yuri-san months ago for the funeral, but that was the only time. He also didn't know how to feel about Yuri-san calling him out of the blue. You mean a na telephone vis sa austalis tvoy golosivo subsheni. He probably explained, but Izuku wasn't able to catch everything he was saying. I'm sorry Yuri-san. I know why you mentioned something about your phone, but I'm not that fluent why yet. He apologized fiddling with his shirt. That is quite alright, Midoriya. I was saying I have your voicemail still. Yuri-san elaborated for him. Izuku nodded to himself as that was a reasonable answer to him. Okay. Forgive for asking. But why are you calling Yuri-san? Izuku inquired. It is quite alright, Midoriya. I should probably be asking you for forgiveness. What I'm about to ask might be a bit forward. Yuri-san told him. Izuku tensed a bit and uncertainty began to leach in and worried what he was about to ask. I was hoping you'd meet with me, Yuri-san said, making Izuku's mind blank, but he quickly continued, clearing up Izuku's confusion. I would like to know more about my granddaughter, and I'm afraid you're the only person who I can ask. Izuku's eyes widened. Part of him felt like he should have expected this, but he mostly felt like a part of his chest was being mangled inside. Oh. He muttered, feeling briefly conflicted about it. On one hand, Izuku knew it would no doubt be an emotional minefield for the two of them, but on the other hand the idea of talking about Yukiko-chan with someone was incredibly tempting. I think I can do that, Yuri-san. Izuku ultimately decided, Blagadaru, Midoriya. I shall text you the location to meet. When do you think we could? Yuri-san questioned. Izuku balked. We could write N now? Still have an hour before I have tea to head home. He timidly offered. Now would be fine. Thank you for this, Midoriya. Yuri-san told him. It's nothing, Yuri-san. Izuku replied, waving his hand despite knowing he couldn't see it. Do svadanya, Midoriya. Yuri-san said and Izuku hesitantly responded. Do svadanya, Yuri-san. Then Yuri-san hung up. Izuku received a text seconds later with a location for him. It was a bit far, but he just had to stay on the train for a few more stops than normal. But when he found himself in front of a rather high-end restaurant, he began to doubt himself. He quickly texted Yuri-san to double-check he was standing in front of the right place because phone GPS has been known to glitch before, right? His private hopes had been dashed when Yuri-san confirmed the restaurant was where he was. Izuku looked down at his clothes and decided that the hoodie and jeans he wore definitely weren't up to whatever dress code the restaurant had. Izuku cautiously entered the building and just at first glance told him that this was the fanciest place he ever stood in. He awkwardly stood at the entrance and meekly approached the host's stand. Is TT there a Yuri-san H here? Izuku timidly asked, hands in a death grip on his messenger bag. The host was looking at him rather critically. The man's eyes went down to what was likely the reservation list. Perhaps, may I inquire as to the nature of your question? He responded. Izuku was about to reply only for Yuri-san to walk up behind him. Ah, Midoriya. I'm pleased you were able to meet with me so quickly. He greeted, a touch of warmth in his tone, but the second his eyes landed on the host, anything that could be considered warmth turned to frigid disdain. A Nadius, net nikaki problem tem, CTO maj rebanok prisodinitsa ko ni za stolakam na divoy, za kotorij azapladal, ne tak li? Even though Izuku couldn't understand what Yuri-san said, he felt vaguely threatened from how cold his voice was. He also thought he heard Yuri-san say, my child, but Izuku must have misheard that part. The host gulped and nodded, no Morozov, sir. The man answered and Yuri-san gave him a very cold smile that clearly didn't reach his eyes. Good. Come along, Midoriya, I'll take you to our table. Yuri-san said, his hand hovering behind Izuku's shoulders, careful not to touch him as he led the anxious greenette away. Izuku didn't protest as to not cause any waves, and he was a bit thankful that the table was in the VIP section, if only for the fact there wasn't anyone nearby them to overhear their conversion. I'm sorry if I'm causing you any problems, Yuri-san. He apologized, feeling even more out of place as they got some looks. There's no need to apologize, Midoriya. I'm the one asking you to go out of your way to see me. Yuri-san told him as he pulled out a chair for Izuku. The chair was undoubtedly the most comfortable one he ever sat in, but the metal parts of it were icy cold. It probably was because of Yuri-san's quirk. Izuku had become admittedly curious of Yuri-san's quirk and how strong it must have been to work on things through gloves. Despite the temptation, Izuku bit his tongue and tried to remain focused on what Yuri-san had asked for. A traitorous gurgle from his stomach made that difficult. Feel free to order anything if you're hungry, Midoriya. I wouldn't want you to skip a meal for me. Yuri-san nonchalantly offered, as if Izuku couldn't see the fact none of the menu items had a price and he knew what that meant price-wise. And no thanks, Yuri-san. I'm fine. Besides, I always have dinner with my mom. It's the only time we have tea to really talk with how busy we both are. He softly protested. Yuri-san hummed back. I'm sure your mother appreciates having such a thoughtful son. Yuri-san mused and Izuku smiled. She's amazing. She gets worried about me working in the South Side sometimes, but she's always been supportive of me. He cheerfully answered. Izuku was happy to gush about his mom to Yuri-san, but quickly cut himself off mid-tangent. I'm sorry, why, Yuri-san? You asked me here to talk about Yukiko-chan. He quickly apologized, waving his hands, but was cut off by a very soft chuckle from Yuri-san, little puffs of condensation coming from his mouth. You don't have to apologize, Midoriya. It's just as nice to learn more about the brilliant young man that helped my family. Yuri-san coolly assured, making Izuku squawk. Utterly flustered by his compliment, Izuku tried to change the topic back to what they were supposed to talk about originally. Izuku regaled Yuri-san with some of the stories he had of when he taught Yukiko-chan and some of the times he had to help Anya-san with Yukiko-chan's quirk. He didn't do anything big and just made some suggestions of cheap products that would work well with their strong ice quirks. Yuri-san would occasionally tell Izuku his own story of he and his late wife caring for a young Anya-san. Izuku was surprised at how much he enjoyed himself talking with Yuri-san, but eventually, it was time for Izuku to leave and Yuri-san had insisted on bringing Izuku home. Yuri-san paid via credit card, then swiftly escorted him to his car. Izuku was expecting it to be a big vehicle given Yuri-san's height, and it was clear he had money with their previous encounters. That being said, sitting in the passenger side, Izuku felt dwarfed in the seat. Izuku rattled off some nervous babble about the other kids he taught at first simply to fill the void of silence. Yuri-san calmly responded to it and even prompted him to tell him more about his work on the south side. The time flew by as Izuku happily talked on and on about his students. Pulling up at the apartment complex, Izuku was a bit disappointed he couldn't continue talking with him. "Thank you for the ride, Yuri-san." Izuku told him, "You're welcome, Midoriya. I've enjoyed speaking with you." Yuri-san replied, helping Izuku out of his car. The step was a bit much for Izuku without jumping, ignoring how mind-numbingly cold his hand got from briefly holding onto Yuri-san's. "Do svidanya, Misroya," he said, and Izuku bowed to him. "Do svidanya, Yuri-san." Izuku responded, then ran over to his building, giving him a wave as he did. Once in his apartment, Izuku quickly got to work making dinner for himself and his mom. Chapter 20. Spreading Your Wings. Zachary's brother had apparently told his friends that Izuku's lessons weren't exclusively for Southsiders, and a couple of brave souls made the trip to the district to see him the next day. Izuku's alias of Deku Sensei had spread further in the wake of the SSI than he thought. He had apparently been a popular gossip topic with the street rats in the Japanese underground after the funeral. More would have already sought him out, but people were territorial and didn't want to cause any fights by entering the south side. With this in mind, Izuku decided to make a day trip and visit other local red light districts to see how welcomed his help would be in those areas. As it turned out, he was actually in quite high demand. Understandably, Izuku couldn't be in that many places at once, and getting from one end of Japan to the other was nearly a 3-day trip all on its own. So Izuku ran some numbers and decided he needed to make some choices. Izuku definitely wanted to reach out to other districts, but it would be near impossible to spend any meaningful time in them before he'd be forced to go home. Alternatively, he could make a schedule of which districts to visit and start traveling en masse. Japan had 38 red light districts. He could maybe visit 5 districts and hold lessons in one of them every day after he finished his coursework for the day. Izuku could easily do his coursework anywhere with an internet connection and his laptop, and there were internet cafes all over. The money he'd make from teaching would probably cover the expenses of travel, and once he made some solid connections, he could stay with his students instead of hotels. Actually, since he could get a car and a license that could cut down on travel time and possible expenses by just getting those. However, there was just one big problem with this idea. It would mainly revolve around and would be dependent on Izuku becoming a nomad living out of a car, his students' houses, or hotels. And as much as Izuku was excited by the thought of traveling all over Japan to help the people that needed him, that would mean Izuku would basically be moving out of the apartment and living on his own, and he didn't think his mom would approve. Inko had been very generous letting him keep working in the south side, especially after the SSI, but Izuku doubted she would be so lenient with this idea. Izuku, as a legal adult, could do it even if she disapproved, but the idea of going against his mom and the possibility of cutting her out of his life was something he was severely uncomfortable with. He loved his mom, and the thought of losing her over this was something that made Izuku feel like he was betraying every moment of support and comfort she gave him. Izuku wanted to help people, and this seemed like the best idea, but his mom's reaction would be the final decision on this matter. Izuku decided to use a notebook to put together a script to explain his idea as best as he could in an ideal timeline for the transition, not only to show her but give the plan some real groundwork. Izuku's nerves had gotten the best of him as he waited for his mom. He ended up doing some chores around the house to kill time and keep his hands busy so he wouldn't pick his fingernails to the point of bleeding as he waited. His nerves didn't disappear when Inko came home from work, and though a bit tired, Inko had picked up on them. "Izuku, is there something wrong? Was there another hero fight?" she asked, and Izuku tensed as he placed their plates on the table. "Why, yeah. There's something I need to talk about with you, but it can wait you until after dinner," Izuku said, brushing it off. He was sure the topic would make eating very difficult. As promised, once they were done, Izuku got his notebook and other things he made for his travel plans and sat down in the living room with his mom. "I've been thinking of expanding my work, actively going to other districts, but it will take something big on my end," he told her. "So let me explain everything first, okay, Mom?" Izuku requested. Inko, sensing the seriousness of the conversation they were probably going to have, did let him go on. Izuku got out the map of Japan he had marked with the locations of all the red light districts. 38 wasn't that many compared to other countries of a similar size, but they were spread out across Japan. Izuku explained how his goal would be to teach in one place and would visit 4 other red lights districts by taking the bullet train, and they would probably accept his help. Inko seemed receptive of that part, and Izuku took her not immediately turning that down as a victory. He went on to show her the travel plan he first made, where he'd leave by the train to other places but how he wouldn't make it halfway before he had to start to go home to be on time for dinner. How even if Izuku were to take a plane he wouldn't make it home on time. If this was my only option it would just be impossible. But if I got my driver's license and a car then I could do this. Izuku went on to explain his plan to start traveling all over Japan, visiting multiple districts by said car, and how he'd be able to live fairly easily with the schedule he had made for himself. Izuku was even able to make it so he could be with his mom every Sunday and even be able to pop in whenever he got close to Musutafu. He carefully detailed his plans if they were going forward, his idea, and how he'd replace the money to pay for just about everything by teaching his students every day like he already was. Inko had remained mostly silent as Izuku told her all of this, which he wasn't sure if it was a good thing or a bad thing. Izuku had been expecting a lot of tears by this point. When he finished off, he was just kind of rambling the minor things and just trailing off. She reached out for one of the papers and simply stared at it with a sad, tired look on her face as she did. Why, you've really thought this out? She mumbled, putting it back down and turning to him. Why, yeah. Well, this is going to be a serious change. If I was going to do this, I wouldn't do it without a real plan. Izuku told her, nervously shrugging. Inko smiled sadly and softly nodded. Then after a few minutes she sighed. Izuku, did you remember when you first told me why you wanted to be a hero? She asked. Izuku blinked, surprised and confused by the sudden change in topic. Yeah. That I wanted to help others? He replied, waiting for her to continue. I know. I'm proud that the only thing you've ever wanted to do is to help others. But when you decided you wanted to go into heroics, I was scared. Inko admitted, the idea of my baby fighting villains, it terrified me, but I tried my best to be supportive of your dream. She confessed, eyes tearing up. Izuku wanted to say his mother's words didn't sting, but he couldn't stop the twinge of hurt that briefly constricted his heart, though he quickly argued with himself that there were worse things than his mom being scared for him. And if I'm being truly honest, when you told me you were going to the south side to tutor people, I wanted to make you stop. She said, and Izuku couldn't help feeling a bolt of fear course through him. She's not saying what I think she's saying. Is she? Surely mom's not going to make me stop altogether, right? She wouldn't. The worst thing that could have happened from this talk was supposed to be mom saying no. Not making me stop altogether. She can't, right? She just can't. He was ripped from his thoughts when Inko suddenly took his hand. Izuku, I have never in my life been so glad I didn't listen to common sense that day. She told him with a wobbly smile. What? Izuku sputtered, having lost track of where this was going and if he should be worried. The day we learned you were quirkless. Why, you might not have given up your dream, but you shut down. It's so hard to describe it, but you just weren't you anymore after that day. She morosely went on to explain, when you told me about the bullying, you opened up a bit, but you were still closed off. Inko added, averting her eyes. But after you started going to the south side, you didn't just open up again, you started thriving. And when that terrible night in January happened, I thought you were going to shut down again. But why you didn't? She said, voice trembling with unspoken emotion as tears finally started falling from her eyes. I know that night hurt you, that it's still hurting you even now, but instead of it stopping you, you used it to go even further than before. Izuku, you've always been very mature for your age, but I've seen you grow so much in these couple of years. Inko told him, glimmers of pride poking through her tears. I've always thought of you as my baby, but seeing you flourish these last months, it's hard to deny the adult you're becoming. She said, gently cupping his face. I've never seen you so alive before, and that's all because of your work. So, if you think you need to do this. Inko paused from speaking to take a deep breath. Then IWW won't stop you, and I'll try to trust your decisions even if they scare me. She confidently told him, a wobbly smile back on her face even as she silently cried. Izuku's eyes had long since started watering and he wrapped his mother in a hug. Thank you, Mom. He whispered as he cried with her. The two greenettes cried for a few minutes before separating. But you're not going anywhere until we make a more solid plan. Inko insisted as she wiped her face. Izuku nodded, his utter joy that she had agreed overshadowing just about everything at the moment.